Hello everyone, I'm pleased to present to you again Lucky, who is no longer just a foster. I have officially foster failed and she's now a permanent member of the family. Say hello, Lucky. All right, so this week we're going to cover codes of ethics. I know it's not an exciting topic, but it is necessary. So ethics are a way of judging. They link thinking and feeling so that reason and emotion mutually shape how we make decisions. Finally, there's this interplay between these feeling-laden judgments and what actions we take. And as Frederick Faray says, no ethical action without thought and feeling, no ethical thought without feeling and potential action, and no ethical feeling without the conceptual recognition and implications for behavior. And it's only through sustained and open dialogue that we can actually develop informed ethical positions. So we've talked about the importance of dialogue before, and we demonstrate it and practice it through our weekly discussions. And we assume that through the sustained and open dialogue, we can communicate across different views and we can be open with each other so that we can re-examine our own values and through the views of others. So self-examination through dialogue and through personal reflection is an ethical responsibility. How your ethical stance is developed shapes the sort of decisions that you're going to make in reference to social work issues, and you practice that with your reflection papers. Let's apply it to a different case today. Let's look at homelessness in the United States. There are more than 500,000 people experiencing homelessness on any given night. Almost half of those are in families. About 25% suffer from mental illnesses, 17% are chronically homeless, 13% are fleeing domestic violence, and 12% are veterans. Partially hidden by my video here, we have a picture of a bench, not just any bus bench, though. This is an example of what is known as hostile architecture, so purposefully designed to keep homeless people away. So whether or not you view hostile architecture as an ethical problem or as a solution to an ethical problem will depend on your ethical position and the ethical theory that you use. Let's look at some of these ethical theories. So they are grouped here based on duality, with the recognition that really most of them are on a continuum. So we've got the ethical relativism versus ethical absolutism theories. In one case, there's the belief that ethics are relative based on your context or culture, versus absolutism, which argues that there's certain ethical values which are universal for everyone. For instance, an example would be that killing is wrong. However, we know that this is not necessarily universal, because here in America we do still have capital punishment, which is killing. There's also whether one focuses on the outcomes versus the processes. So the outcome being to, eradicate homelessness, and the process being how you do it. So do you focus on the ends, or do you focus on the means of how it happens? There's also the duality between doing one's duty versus what's right. So in one case, the onus is on the individual, take action. On the other case, it's the responsibility of society to ensure that all individuals are taken care of. Now we've got the virtue-based versus common good theories. The virtue-based ones really focus on the individual as a virtuous being who makes ethical decisions and ethical actions. And the common good ones are focused on the community as a whole and ensuring that decisions made benefit the community. not just the individual. And those are very much related to the fairness/equality ethical theories versus the equity-based principles we've talked about before, right? So with the fairness principles, we do the same thing for everybody regardless of their need, versus with the equity-based principles, we acknowledge differences in need. So as I mentioned, the perspective that we take is really going to shape the questions that we ask about this issue and the actions that we take as a result. So we will look at consequences of actions in different ways. If the point of fixing the homelessness issue is just to make the homeless less visible, things like hostile architecture is what you're going to engage in. If the end result that you're looking for is to actually decrease homelessness, then you might look at some of the primary drivers of homelessness and look to address those. If you're taking a more individual-based approach, then you would provide housing to each homeless individual. Who you provide housing to might be influenced by whether you subscribe to the virtue-based worthiness principle. So is somebody worthy or unworthy of receiving a home? Those are all decisions that you make based on what ethical principles you subscribe to. They influence what is morally justifiable to you. So these are some questions that you want to consider as you are faced with ethical decisions and social work issues. You might want to take a moment throughout your career, every month or so, and really reflect on yourself. How is your personal experiences, how are they influencing the prejudgments you come to? This is going to be particularly important the longer you are in social work, because you will encounter individuals and situations that might make you lose hope in people's capacity for change. However, that's why debriefing and supervision is very important to ensure that your prejudgments are not influencing your work. So your biases and attitudes are not going to impact the care you're providing. You also have to think about your own character and what you hold to be virtuous, and the principles and ethical theories that are guiding the decisions that you make. You need to consider your own beliefs about people. Do you think that people have free will and make all of their decisions freely? Or do you subscribe to a more deterministic line of thinking, wherein people's choices are very much constrained by their context, therefore limiting anything that they can actually do? Or is it somewhere in between? You also need to consider how your spirituality might be impacting how you view others and how you interact with others. And you need to consider how your focus, whether you're more focused on individual rights or social responsibility to the community. Within social work, we face our ethical dilemmas using the social work code of ethics developed by the National Association of Social Workers. So we have covered these core values before, so I won't spend long on them, but consider which values these principles place at the forefront, which are deemed to be most important. And let's consider how these came about. So they're very much shaped by history, and there was a lot of push and pull between the professionalism aspect of social work and the advocacy aspect. In the 1920s, immediately after the First World War, Mary Richmond developed ethical principles to guide social work practice, with a pretty heavy focus on clinical practice following the medical model. In 1947, again, immediately after the Second World War, the American Association of Social Workers adopted a code of ethics. However, again, because of the backlash of social advocacy after the war, this was very much based on the medical model. It wasn't until the 1960s that the National Association of Social Workers first formalized a code of ethics that focused a little bit more on the social advocacy part. And even then, it wasn't until later in the 60s that non-discrimination policies were actually added in. So throughout social work's history, there's been this tension between activism and professionalism. Every time the social work tried to establish itself as a profession, there was pushback from society that professionals don't engage in activism. And what are the ethical implications of this? How did it impact uh, how social workers practiced? For instance, immediately after the First World War, immediately after the Second World War, we learned last week that during those times, social workers were actually persecuted by the government because they were seen as promoting communism. Let's look at a different code of ethics now. So this is the code of ethics used by the National Association of Black Social Workers. Look at how different it is from the code of ethics that you're familiar with from the National Association of Social Workers. So notice first that I statements are used as opposed to the third person statements in the NASO code of ethics. And notice here how I've highlighted some key phrases for you. So the code of ethics highlight that the focus is very much on families and extended families, not the nuclear heteronormative standard that is traditionally used. And there's very much within the fourth and fifth bullet point, there's a focus on the individual holding organizations accountable. There's nothing like that within the NASO code of ethics, right? It's assumed that organizations are already doing their best as opposed to recognizing the discriminatory and structural oppressions that they might be perpetuating against the Black community. And this last point here also encourages Black social workers to engage in voluntary service over and above their paid social work practice. There's many more components of the code of ethics. I just wanted to highlight a few key ones. We've also got the Code of Ethics for Radical Social Services. So this emerged subsequent to the Civil Rights Movement, and it very much reflected the recognition that social work should be a social activist profession. It was not, unfortunately, widely taken up, but it would have been nice if we really were revolutionaries looking to facilitate humanistic change in society. However, it was very much not widely used. Internationally, we've got the International Federation of Social Workers, which through a lot of work balanced universalism and relativism. So due to the fact that many different cultures took part in the development of this code of ethics, we had to recognize that what is accepted as truth in one culture is not necessarily the same in another culture. So that's where that balance is. And we talked about this earlier in the lecture when we talked about relativism versus absolutism. This is the same. Within the IFSW Code of Ethics, there's very much an emphasis on human dignity and human rights. Which is completely, or no, I shouldn't say that anymore. They did update it. It used to be absent from the NASO Code of Ethics. And everything is framed as a statement of principles rather than a code. And this is important since it comes from the moral recognition that social workers don't need a code to follow, that just the presence of the principles should be enough to influence their behavior. Let's look at a couple different countries and how they have structured their social work codes of ethics. Here's one example from Canada. There's very much a strong commitment to human rights within the Canadian Association of Social Workers. code of ethics, and an example of that is represented by this picture here. This is Dr. Cindy Blackstock. She's a social worker, and she and her organization actually took the Canadian government to court, arguing that Canadian government was violating the human rights of the Canadian Aboriginal children population. And she was successful. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruled in her favor 3 years ago, and for the past 3 years, the federal government has tried to fight it, but she has been successful each time. And at the last court hearing, the Human Rights Tribunal actually held the Canadian government, threatened them with contempt for refusing to follow through, and they have finally set out the billions of dollars that the Human Rights Tribunal ordered to make reparations. Next, we've got India, which is very much in contrast to Western codes of ethics, where the focus is on the community. So it's people-centered, with the recognition that the people are a community working together, and that just focusing on one individual is not sufficient to help the community. And there's also the recognition of environmental ethics and the harmony with other life forms that if we don't have, again, that community cannot exist. And lastly, we've got New Zealand, which actually has a bicultural code of ethics that recognizes Maori rights, history, and identity. And let me show you what the New Zealand education or social work education framework is. So it's very much indigenized with the history and the impacts of colonialism on the Maori population very much front and center in what is recommended to be taught within social work schools. What it says here, that treaty-based social work teaching and learning, that means treaty-based. So the treaty between the Maori peoples and the New Zealand government, which focuses on centering the Maori knowledge and the Maori language within what is taught, while recognizing that racism and white privilege exist at the same time as an identity and a resilience and a resistance that's capable of healing. So you can see that it's quite different from what you guys are taught when you're taught about social work ethics.